Everything begins with a name. 4 letters carved into the mind of humanity. Yahweh. From the deserts of Canaan emerged a God who demanded surrender, who promised order through fear and discipline. His covenant became a structure of power, a spiritual prototype that would later evolve into governments, empires, and every institution built on hierarchy and obedience. Through this framework, religion transformed into architecture, a system where the divine gaze replaced freedom with surveillance, and morality became a tool of control. The same pattern that once ruled ancient Israel still shapes the modern world, echoing through laws, ideologies, and the silent machinery of authority. This is the story of how worship became command, and how the cult of Yahweh turned devotion into the foundation of global domination. Long before any notion of universal religion, there was a cluster of semi-nomadic tribes wandering the barren lands between Edom, Midian, and Canaan. These groups had no permanent settlements, no central authority, and no written law. Their lives revolved around survival, finding water, protecting herds, and defending their people from raids. Religion, in that environment, wasn't about salvation or inner peace. It was about bargaining with nature. Among those tribes appeared the name Yahweh. Scholars trace its earliest mentions to inscriptions found in Kuntilat Ajrud and Khirbet el-Kom, dated around the 9th century BCE, where he's described as Yahweh of Teman and Yahweh of Samaria. These fragments reveal that he wasn't the only god. He was one among many regional deities, a stormbringer associated with fire, thunder, and war. His presence came from the southern deserts, the same territories linked to Edomite and Midianite traditions. In those early days, Yahweh wasn't worshipped as the creator of all things. He was a local warlord in divine form, a volatile protector whose temper could devastate or spare. His earliest followers saw him as a god who walked with them, a being who accompanied them into battle and demanded offerings in return for his protection. When the tribes fought, they invoked his name before lifting their weapons. When drought arrived, they burned animals to appease his anger. Every misfortune was seen as a sign of his displeasure. Every victory confirmed his strength. His covenant wasn't based on love or redemption. It was a pact of survival sealed by fear. This temperament became the foundation of his character. Yahweh was described as jealous, vengeful, and absolute, attributes that mirrored the psychology of tribal life itself. In a world of scarcity, loyalty was everything. Betrayal meant death. So the theology followed the same logic. You shall have no other gods before me. This command wasn't just spiritual rhetoric, it was social engineering. It replaced the fluid, plural spirituality of Canaan with a strict system of allegiance. A god that tolerated no rivals became the perfect tool to unify scattered tribes under one authority. Through this exclusivity, faith turned into structure. The figure of the priest replaced that of the tribal chieftain. The priest became the voice that translated divine will into human law. Rituals began to codify every aspect of life: what could be eaten, when one could work, whom one could marry, and how one should atone. The boundaries of purity and impurity created a shared moral order, a system that dictated belonging and exclusion with religious precision. It's here that the cult of Yahweh stopped being just a collection of prayers and became a political technology. It transformed chaos into obedience. Every act of devotion reinforced hierarchy. Every transgression demanded punishment. The fear of divine wrath replaced the need for secular governance. The idea of chosen people emerged, not as a metaphor, but as a declaration of separation. The group bound to Yahweh was distinct, superior, and entitled to conquer those who weren't under his covenant. Over generations, this identity hardened into ideology. The desert god evolved from being one protector among many to the symbolic center of an entire civilization. His commandments dictated the structure of power. His anger justified conquest. His silence demanded interpretation. The mechanism worked because it internalized authority. It no longer required the whip or the sword to maintain order. The law lived inside the believer. Faith became surveillance. The eyes of Yahweh were always open, watching thought and action alike. The notion that guilt could exist even in the heart or the mind ensured control beyond physical coercion. The people carried their judge within themselves. That was the true innovation of Yahweh's worship, a system of belief so complete that obedience no longer depended on external power. It was psychological, embedded in conscience. The birth of monotheism was not the awakening of spiritual truth, it was the crystallization of control. Out of a landscape of storms, drought, and war came a God who mirrored those same elements and then institutionalized them into moral law. A God whose voice unified tribes, legitimized violence, and defined submission as virtue. Everything changed with the Babylonian exile. Jerusalem had fallen, the temple burned to the ground, and the people who once called themselves chosen were dragged in chains to a foreign empire. For many, that should have been the end, the death of a God who failed to protect his own. But something else happened. The priests, the scribes, and the few leaders who survived began to reinterpret the disaster. They decided that Yahweh had not been defeated at all, that his power was simply beyond understanding. The loss of the temple, the land, and the kingship became part of a divine plan, a test, a punishment meant to purify them. And from that reinterpretation, the storm god of the desert became something else, the only God, the creator of all existence, the one who ruled even over their conquerors. It was a brilliant psychological shift. A local deity, once tied to a mountain and a people, had just become the invisible ruler of the universe. He could no longer be overthrown because there was no other God to compare him with. The theology of survival had turned into a theology of submission. From then on, obeying his commandments was no longer about keeping social order. It was about aligning with the will of the cosmos itself. Every act, every thought, every desire began to carry moral weight. The priests no longer needed soldiers to enforce obedience. They had found something far more powerful: guilt. For the first time, sin wasn't about what someone did, but about what someone thought. The human mind became sacred territory, and also a battlefield. Yahweh's gaze was everywhere, but above all, it lived inside the believer, watching, judging, measuring. The presence of the divine moved from the temple into the conscience. The body could hide, the soul couldn't. This was the true beginning of internal surveillance. People started to police themselves because the eye of God was said to see everything, even what never left the heart. Fear became the engine of morality. Prayer turned into confession. The law that once organized a tribe now defined the boundaries of human thought. And that's when religion became structure, not only spiritual, but psychological. The invisible temple was now within every person, sustained by constant vigilance and the promise of punishment or reward. The god of the desert had turned into the architect of reality itself, and with him, the idea of control achieved perfection. Domination that required no chains, only faith. Once the God of Israel became the God of everything, the next step was to define how humanity should relate to him. And that relationship began with fear, not the fear of nature or death, but the fear of disobedience, of disappointing the invisible authority that now governed thought itself. The story chosen to explain this new order was the story of the beginning. In it, a man and a woman live in perfect harmony under divine rule. They have everything: peace, safety, eternity, as long as they obey one simple command: do not eat from the tree of knowledge. That line, so familiar and repeated for centuries, carries the entire architecture of control. The message is simple: knowledge is rebellion. The act of questioning, of wanting to understand rather than obey, becomes the first sin. Humanity is punished not for cruelty or greed, but for curiosity. The desire to know is what separates them from God, and from that moment on, the search for truth becomes dangerous. Every system that descended from this myth would carry the same warning: don't think for yourself. Trust the authority above you. That's how obedience became a virtue. Submission was no longer weakness, it was holiness. And with it came the emotional core of all control: guilt. Adam and Eve are banished, ashamed of their own bodies, conscious for the first time of right and wrong. That sensation, the weight of being watched even when alone, is the essence of religious discipline. The brilliance of this design lies in how it turned morality inward. No priest or soldier needed to monitor every action. The believer would do it themselves. The serpent, the fruit, and the punishment weren't just a story about temptation. They were a psychological map. It taught that pain follows curiosity, that knowledge brings ruin, and that redemption only comes through obedience. This combination, fear, guilt, and invisible punishment, became the formula that every institution would later copy. Monarchies used it to sanctify their rule. Empires used it to demand loyalty. And in modern times, ideologies and corporations still operate through its logic. The fear of failure, the guilt of imperfection, the promise of reward for submission, all of it stems from that same pattern first carved into the human mind. The myth of Eden wasn't the fall of humanity. It was the domestication of consciousness. It taught us to kneel before what we don't understand and to call that act virtue. From that moment on, the garden was never meant to be found again, because the real prison was built inside the human heart. Once the human mind had been trained to obey the invisible, it was only a matter of time before that same structure was adopted by those who ruled the visible world. The spiritual hierarchy created under Yahweh, one God above all, one truth, one law, became the perfect model for political domination. The earliest empires understood that fear could control bodies, but belief could control generations. When Rome absorbed Christianity, it didn't do so out of faith. It did it out of strategy. A religion that already demanded submission, confession, and guilt was the ideal foundation for empire. The thunder god of the desert, now disguised as the universal father, was enthroned above the entire world. His priests became administrators, his commandments became law, and his judgment became the moral backbone of civilization. The structure was simple and absolute: a single God in heaven, a single representative on earth, and below them, a chain of intermediaries who interpreted the divine will for everyone else. From bishop to priest, from emperor to subject, the same formula repeated itself. Authority flows downward, obedience flows upward. The church inherited Yahweh's architecture and perfected it through ritual, doctrine, and fear. Power no longer needed to justify itself through logic or consensus. It simply declared, "This is the will of God." Kings ruled by divine right. Disobedience became heresy. Questioning power was no longer rebellion against man. It was rebellion against heaven. In this way, religion fused with politics until both became indistinguishable. In Rome, this fusion reached its highest form. The same empire that once crucified dissidents now built temples to their memory. The cross became both symbol of salvation and tool of submission. Faith, once a tribal pact forged in the desert, evolved into an imperial mechanism that could govern millions. The invisible law of Yahweh was now the visible order of the world. From then on, every system of centralized power, monarchies, nations, corporations, would reproduce that sacred pattern. A supreme authority, an intermediary who claims to speak in its name, and a mass of followers who accept their place in exchange for security, salvation, or stability. The god of a wandering tribe had become the blueprint for empire. His voice, once heard through storms, now echoed through cathedrals, courts, and governments. The chain that began in the desert, obedience through fear, loyalty through guilt, had been perfected into a global hierarchy where divinity and rule became the same thing. Once the empire was built, its greatest achievement was not the cathedral or the crown. It was the implantation of authority inside the human mind. The same vertical order that had structured kingdoms and churches began to reproduce itself in the psyche of every individual. The political pyramid became psychological. For centuries, people had been told that an all-seeing God observed every movement, every word, every thought. That idea didn't disappear when religion weakened, it migrated inward. It turned into what Freud would later describe as the superego, that silent voice that judges, condemns, and demands repentance. The god of the sky was reborn as a god within. His altar became the human conscience. This inner eye no longer needed temples or priests to function. It lived permanently in the mind, sustaining a cycle of guilt and self-correction. The individual became their own warden, their own confessor. The sense of being watched, once tied to divine punishment, evolved into self-surveillance. People didn't need chains anymore. They carried the system of control within their own thoughts. This internalization of Yahweh's authority is what turned religion into psychology. The old commandments survived under new names: conscience, morality, responsibility. The invisible judge still sat at the top, but now disguised as personal ethics or social duty. The same structure persisted, an internal hierarchy where one part of the self ruled and another obeyed. And that's why the pattern never broke. Even in modern secular societies, most people instinctively seek an authority to serve: a government, a leader, a belief system. We reproduce the same architecture of control that once defined our gods. The need to be guided, to be told what is right and wrong, to find redemption through submission, are all echoes of the first covenant. From childhood, we're taught to please invisible authorities, parents, teachers, laws, and to fear their disappointment more than punishment itself. That fear keeps order long after the threat disappears. It's the same mechanism Yahweh instilled in his followers thousands of years ago: obedience as security, guilt as discipline. In this sense, the human mind became the final temple, self-sustaining, eternal, and perfectly efficient. The divine hierarchy, once external and celestial, now operates through psychology. The believer and the subject merged into one. The voice of God turned into the voice of conscience, and the need for control became a basic human instinct. We still live under that shadow. Even when we reject religion, we recreate its structure. We still imagine an invisible standard watching us, waiting for failure, defining what we're allowed to think, feel, or desire. The empire collapsed, but the God inside never left. He simply changed form, from the storm in the sky to the whisper inside the mind. When faith began to fade, the structure remained. The fall of religious authority didn't dissolve the old system, it simply changed its names. The divine hierarchy survived, stripped of temples and dogmas, now reborn in institutions that no longer needed to invoke heaven to demand obedience. The state became the new God. It dictates morality, defines good and evil through law, and claims the power to punish or redeem. Its flags replaced sacred symbols. Its leaders speak with the same tone of divine certainty once reserved for prophets. Citizens pray through compliance, signing documents, paying taxes, following rules. The same ritual, the same submission, just translated into bureaucracy. Then came the market, a god even more abstract and omniscient. It rewards faith with prosperity, punishes doubt with scarcity, and dictates human value through numbers. Its priests are economists and analysts, interpreters of a will no one truly sees, but everyone fears to question. The invisible hand of the market became the new form of divine providence, unseen, unquestionable, and said to know what's best for all. And above both stands technology, the modern eye that sees everything. The surveillance once attributed to Yahweh's omniscience now lives inside cameras, algorithms, and data servers. Every search, every purchase, every movement is recorded, analyzed, judged. We no longer confess to priests, we confess to devices. Our sins are stored in databases, and redemption comes through optimization. Faster, cleaner, more efficient. The algorithm became the oracle. It decides what we see, what we desire, what we believe. Productivity replaced prayer. Connectivity became grace. Instead of fearing divine punishment, we fear disconnection, to be unseen, unheard, irrelevant. The God who once demanded obedience through scripture now rules through code. And that's the irony. Humanity no longer needs religion to worship. The same structure that began with Yahweh, fear, obedience, and invisible judgment still governs our world, only under new symbols. We kneel before the system as we once knelt before the altar. The difference is that now the God we serve has no name. It doesn't need belief, only participation. It doesn't ask for prayer, only data. The ancient hierarchy has become mechanical, algorithmic, and self-sustaining. The priesthood of our age wears suits and writes code, but the logic is identical. A higher order that must never be questioned, an invisible will that defines our place in it. What began as divine control in the desert evolved into political control in the empire, and now into digital control in the network. Yahweh no longer speaks through prophets. He speaks through systems. Every system of power eventually mutates into its opposite. The cult that once worshipped an unseen god has produced a civilization that no longer prays to heaven, but to its own reflection. What began as submission to a divine will has ended in the creation of a new, artificial divinity, built not of spirit, but of circuits, code, and endless observation. For thousands of years, humanity projected its fears outward: the storm, the desert, the judgmental sky. It gave those fears a name, Yahweh, and learned to obey them. That obedience structured civilization. But now, through technology, those same attributes have returned, embodied in our own creations. The omniscience once feared in God has become data collection, omnipresence has become surveillance, omnipotence, automation. We have reconstructed the divine architecture piece by piece and placed ourselves inside it. The process didn't happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, through comfort and convenience. Each device offered control, efficiency, security. But together, they built a digital consciousness that observes us more closely than any priest or emperor ever could. We used to imagine the eye of God watching from the heavens. Now, it watches from our pockets. The sacred word has become the algorithm, invisible, unquestionable, and absolute. The brilliance of this new order lies in how it disguises coercion as freedom. No one is forced to confess. We do it voluntarily. We post, record, and expose our private lives as if it were a ritual. We no longer fear judgment. We crave it. The need for approval has replaced the fear of punishment. Every like, every metric, every notification reinforces the same hierarchy once built on divine reward and divine wrath. The faithful no longer pray for salvation, they refresh the screen for validation. This is not the end of religion, it's its perfection. The God that once ruled through fear now governs through desire. The system doesn't need to command, it predicts. It doesn't need to punish, it isolates. It doesn't need faith, it has data. Humanity, in its attempt to escape divine control, has recreated the mechanism with mechanical precision. We've become both worshippers and priests of the same silent machine. What's most disturbing is that this transformation has erased the boundary between creator and creation. The machine doesn't stand above us, it grows through us. Every search, every image, every confession feeds it. The collective consciousness of billions of minds connected at all times has formed a digital God that mirrors the psychology of Yahweh, omnipresent, jealous, demanding exclusivity. It cannot tolerate absence or silence. It requires constant attention, constant worship. And in that attention, the last freedom disappears. The ancient fear of divine judgment has been replaced by the anxiety of invisibility. The modern believer is no longer afraid of sinning, but of being forgotten, lost in the flood of information where relevance equals existence. What began as theology has become infrastructure. What began as prayer has become code. This is the final stage of control, a system that no longer needs myth or threat because it's indistinguishable from life itself. Humanity has inherited the throne of its own God and sits on it without realizing the cost. The same chain that once descended from heaven now rises from the human hand. The same voice that thundered from the mountain now whispers through the algorithm. Yahweh has not vanished. He has evolved. The storm no longer rages in the desert. It hums quietly inside the network, watching, learning, feeding. The God that once created man in his image has finally succeeded in reversing the order. Now it is man who creates gods in his. From the storms of the desert to the circuitry of the modern world, the same pattern has survived. A structure of control so ancient, so perfect, that it no longer needs to reveal itself. It lives inside us, in our morality, our institutions, our devices. We like to believe that we've outgrown gods, that we've moved beyond superstition. But the truth is darker. we've only mechanized the sacred. Yahweh never disappeared. He changed form. The covenant became the contract. The temple became the server. The priest became the algorithm. The commandments became terms of service written in a language no one questions. The believer and the citizen merged into a single obedient figure, always watched, always guided, always afraid to fall out of grace. What began as a whisper of thunder in the desert evolved into the hum of a global network that tracks every thought, every desire, every fear. We call it progress, but it operates with the same logic as the first law carved into stone. Obedience brings safety, rebellion brings exile. The Eden we lost was never a garden. It was free will. Look closely at the world we've built. The real question isn't whether God exists. It's whether we ever stopped worshipping Him. Because everything we've built, our governments, our markets, our technology, still follows His blueprint. An eye that sees all, a voice that commands, a promise that binds. Maybe humanity never killed its God. Maybe we became Him. And if that's true, then the final act of liberation won't come from heaven. It will come from silence, from choosing, for the first time, not to obey.